freedom of speech,
fundamental rights,
freedom of conscience,
academic freedom,
freedom of press,
and the right to listen.
You're listening to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, brought to you by FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education.
Okay, welcome back to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, where every other week we take an uncensored look at the world of free expression through personal stories and candid conversations. I am, as always, your host, Nico Perrino, reporting from quarantine here outside the Washington, D.C. area. And we have a very exciting episode for you today. I'm recording remotely, of course, and I have two guests also recording remotely, both of whom have been on the podcast before. The first guest coming to us from overseas in Denmark is Jakob Mchangama. He is the executive director of Justitia, a Copenhagen-based think tank that focuses on human rights and the rule of law. And he is also the host and producer of the excellent podcast, Clear and Present Danger, A History of Free Speech. Jakob, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much, Nico. It's a pleasure to be back on. I really look forward to it.
And our next guest is Sarah McLaughlin. She is the director of Targeted Advocacy here at the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, a longtime colleague, and also, again, a returning guest to the show. Sarah, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Nico.
Sarah, we haven't seen each other in a while because, of course, our offices have been shut down. How are you holding up?
I'm okay. I haven't seen too many people in a while, but it's okay.
And Jakob, how are things in Denmark?
Well, actually, things are starting to look up a bit. So our government initiated a partial shutdown pretty early on. Actually, I was flying back from DC from a conference at Cato about free speech, and I think I was on one of the last planes out of there before everything shut down. But next week, this week, kids will start going back to school. And so we'll see sort of a gradual opening.
Well, that's wonderful. We still do not know when things will open up back here in the United States. Looks like I'll be working from home. Sarah and I will be working from home for the foreseeable future. But it was, a week or so ago, a little over a week, that you and Sarah had published a co-authored piece in Foreign Policy about the coronavirus and how it's starting a, quote, censorship pandemic. Sarah, let's start with you. Why did you and Jakob get together to write this article? What was the inspiration?
Well, we've written a couple pieces together before, just about international speech issues we watch. We both follow the trends pretty closely. And we noticed that almost every day there were these articles popping up about fake news arrests in Turkey, fake news arrests in Thailand. And we started seeing a major trend that I don't think I have ever seen before, that many fake news arrests happening at once.
So, I mean, you're anyone who follows you on Twitter knows you are a regular watcher of Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey. And it seems like this coronavirus has given him yet another reason to go after his critics. I think it was a March 16th report that you and Jakob write in your article. They had identified at least 93 suspects allegedly responsible for unfounded and provocative social media comments about the coronavirus. How have things developed in Turkey, and have they gotten worse since that March 16th report?
They have gotten worse. Now they're in the hundreds of arrests, I believe, for fake news. So pretty much, and this is what we're seeing in a lot of places, it's not just clearly wrong information. It's provocative posts that suggest that the government isn't handling the outbreak correctly. And, people like Erdogan and authoritarians like him, that's what they like least. People suggesting they're not very good at their jobs. So this has proven to be another opportunity to go after critics and say, they're just trying to cause a panic. They're harming our country. We need to put them in prison.
One of the things that we've actually seen as a result of the coronavirus outbreak are some governments, local or federal here in the United States, releasing nonviolent criminals, people accused of breaking law or charged and convicted with breaking the law, I should say. And I guess I saw reports that in Turkey they had actually started releasing some prisoners, but not the political prisoners.
That's correct. Yeah. So I wish I could remember who wrote it, but I read an op-ed in the Washington Post And someone suggested that, someone who was corrupt, a corrupt politician, could be set free right now, but the journalists who reported that corruption would still be in prison because journalists, activists, people who have written about human rights, they're not allowed out of prison right now.
Jakob, were you following the developments out of China early in the crisis and kind of how they were responding to reports about the coronavirus?
I was, because we actually had an interesting case here in Denmark where a newspaper, actually Jyllandsposten, the very newspaper that published the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad that led to sort of a huge free speech crisis, they published a cartoon of the Chinese flag, and then instead of sort of stars, they had sort of coronavirus symbols, and the Chinese embassy vehemently protested, demanded an apology, and behaved as they always do whenever something slights the supposed the so-called or hurt the so-called feelings of the Chinese people, which basically means saying something that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't like, and there were similar incidents, I believe, in Belgium. So that sort of focused my attention on it from back in January. But then and then obviously I followed the stories of the censorship in China, which may well have contributed to this turning into a pandemic rather than a more localized epidemic that perhaps could have been handled earlier if there had been transparency rather than sort of stonewalling and trying to shove everything under the carpet.
Yeah, I mean, I think the early stories indicated that one of the first doctors to report on this new and novel disease had been approached by the authorities. I don't know if he had been actually thrown in prison in Wuhan, in the Wuhan province, but he ultimately contracted the coronavirus and then died subsequently. And there's also indications and reporting going on right now that the outbreak in China was worse than we've been led to believe. I think I've seen reports that China had purchased a significant number of body bags, which it can't account for the number of dead that they actually reported. But again, that's all reporting that I've seen, and perhaps speculative. We can't get confirmation because the Chinese government is usually pretty restrictive on those sorts of things. Jakob, Viktor Orban in Hungary has been kind of a leader in the crackdown on civil liberties for years now, and he's seized the opportunity that the coronavirus outbreak presents to take that a step further, correct?
Yeah, he certainly has. I mean, he for the past decade or so, he has sort of slowly but steadily tried to dismantle Hungary's democracy, and trying to sort of impose a more nationalist conservative version of illiberal democracy. And so, like any good authoritarian, he saw an opportunity with this crisis because people have a tendency to rally around political leaders and be fine with restrictions in times of crisis and fear and uncertainty. And so he's basically allowed to rule by decree, and that can theoretically be revoked by parliament, requiring. But he has basically a supermajority in parliament. So basically, I think he'll be calling the shots. But from the point of view of free speech, the most worrying thing is that this was accompanied by an amendment of the criminal code, which would allow people to be imprisoned for up to 5 years for spreading fake news about the coronavirus and the government's response to it. So that obviously has a chilling effect on critical journalism, which is already suffering in Hungary, where you have very few independent newspapers, print newspapers left, because in another classic move by authoritarians, Orban and his cronies have bought up a lot of independent newspapers. So that I think, and this is a European Union member state, Hungary, which has led some commentators like Anne Applebaum, for instance, who writes in The Atlantic, to call to say that now officially Hungary is a dictatorship. I don't know if that's maybe taking it too far, but there can be no doubt that this is a very serious authoritarian threat and a clear and present danger, if you like, to media freedom and free speech in general in Hungary, which is already at least been put on a ventilator.
Yeah, what's the European Union's response been to these developments in Hungary? If there have been any developments to the recent efforts to consolidate power under Viktor Orban, or more generally, I mean, it is a EU member state, but it's not on the euro, correct?
Yeah. So
I don't think so.
The response has been quite meek against. I mean, the European Union is really struggling to find out what to do about Hungary and also Poland. Both these member states are systematically undermining the rule of law, liberal democratic values. But so there was this statement by a number of European Union member states, including Denmark and the Netherlands, which said that yes, member states can take exceptional measures, but they have to respect fundamental values, be proportionate, and should not undermine press freedom and freedom of expression. Now, that was clearly meant to target Hungary, but it didn't specifically mention Hungary. And smart as Orban is, his government then said, well, we'll just join this this statement by the European Union. So that turned into a bit of a diplomatic own goal. And I don't know that there's appetite to really forcefully go after Hungary. Because I really think that when you look at sort of the countries that Sarah and I identified in our piece, the fake news laws, with one or two exceptions, really tend to be the authoritarian illiberal states, whereas I would say most of the classic liberal democracies have shied away from that. They have certainly restricted freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, and so on, but less frequently gone after, you could say, opinion and news and the sharing of information. So I think that is a really important red line when trying to determine which states have handled these measures in the most democratic and least authoritarian way.
Sarah, I know you track actions by foreign governments with respect to freedom of expression pretty closely. You did it even before this crisis. Is that kind of your impression as well, that the liberal democratic countries have cracked down less on free expression than the more authoritarian ones? Or have you even seen some more liberal democratic countries start to implement measures on freedom of expression that one might call illiberal? I know you and Jakob in your piece identify South Africa as one of the countries that's placing restrictions on expression.
Yeah, I would say generally the speech restrictions going on because of coronavirus track with what was already going on in countries before. A lot of the countries on this list already had some kind of restriction on libel against the government, insult to the government, and that's what a lot of these fake news bans are ultimately turning out to be, I think. Some form of criticism of the government. But there are places where we have bans popping up. Actually, last week in Puerto Rico, they made it illegal to transmit or allow the transmission of false information with the intention of creating confusion or panic about executive orders about coronavirus. And as a U.S. territory, there are obviously some serious First Amendment questions raised by that.
And we've also seen, I mean, separate from what governments are doing, you and Jakob talk about what social media companies are doing in response to the coronavirus. Can you two talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually have I think on Wednesday I'm doing an interview with Monica Biggert, who's the head of public policy, I think, at Facebook, and so responsible for their content moderation and community standards. So it'll be very interesting to hear what they say. But I think at least early on, what we saw was that Silicon Valley is not immune to coronavirus. So a lot of people could no longer work in the office. So that also affected moderators, and so they ramped up AI, the use of AI or automated content moderation, which seemed to affect more bona fide journalistic stories than usually. So there were pieces from the New York Times and Atlantic that were removed because it was sort of a blunt instrument often when you try to use AI to determine what is disinformation or not. And just in general, I think they're trying to walk this tightrope between ensuring the flow of essential information to people, because we're all sitting online sort of looking desperately to try to understand the nature of this crisis, and then trying to filter out disinformation. But I think that's, I mean, how it's not always very easy, because you have in February, I believe, sort of the Surgeon General going out and saying, don't use face masks, don't buy them. And then you have the CDC later on going out and say, actually, you should make these face masks yourself. And the Surgeon General demonstrating how you should do it. Here in Denmark, we've had our health authorities in January late January saying, oh, there's very little risk of the coronavirus spreading to Denmark. And also until just a few days ago, they said there was very little risk of catching coronavirus from people who are asymptomatic, which, for months studies had shown the opposite, which is, I guess, one of the reasons why this has turned into a pandemic, because you can actually infect others even though you're asymptomatic. So I guess it's, even health authorities and experts don't fully understand it. The data, everything is in flux. So how you determine whether something is disinformation or not, apart from, drink bleach and it'll and it'll cure you, I think is difficult.
Or in the United States, we had a couple that, hearing about the hydroxychloroquine alleged treatment for coronavirus, had drinking like, or ate chlorine tablets from their pool or something.
I think their aquarium.
Even worse, yeah. Thinking that might do something for them. So, have we seen for sure? Are we for sure on the reporting that the bots are responsible for the increase in posts being taken down on social media? I mean, has Facebook so much as recognized that at this point, that they're just using blunt instruments because they can't bring people into the office to?
It's a good question. It's something that I'll certainly ask Monica on Wednesday. It was a piece in the Wire in Wired, which I think is normally quite credible on all things tech. Yeah. So from the outset, I think that it is a credible story, though they may well have tweaked their algorithms and sort of ensured a better hit and miss ratio. But though again, it's another interesting question. Once are they going to release all the data of how much they removed compared to normal periods? And they have fact checkers, but how do you fact check the fact checkers? So I think in general there'll be a lot of evaluation about how everyone has handled this, and I think we should definitely also demand transparency and scrutiny of social media companies on how they managed the flow of information.
Yeah, I don't know if it's so much related to the coronavirus crisis, although the timeline seems to suggest it is. But we at Fire, we post ads on social media and Facebook in order to advertise our programs, and we've been finding increasingly in the past couple of weeks that our ads are getting declined and then getting approved on subsequent appeal, which we always need to make tweaks to ads here and there in order to get them approved on Facebook, because I guess freedom of expression, or promoting freedom of expression, is considered political advocacy by Facebook. So you have to go through a special process, but never have we dealt so much with a situation where almost all of our ads are getting disapproved at the outset and then getting approved on appeal, because they do comport with their community standards and their rules and regulations. But this is something that we've been noticing in the past couple of weeks. Sarah, I want to ask you again, Is there a country that you seem to be the worst actor as far as the fake news bans go, or the imprisoning of people who are spreading quote unquote disinformation or panic?
So I don't know too much about the enforcement yet, but from what I've read, Zimbabwe had probably the most severe response so far. They enacted a lockdown where a provision of it punishes the publication of fake news with up to 20 years imprisonment, which is probably the most severe one I've seen so far. Most are in, months to 5 years. But 20 years is extreme.
Yeah. There was a report that Turkmenistan banned the use of the word coronavirus, but I think that turned out to be actually not true, a misunderstanding of their policy. Even though, although Turkmenistan is an extreme country when it comes to to censorship, and but that was a report. I think it was mentioned even in NPR and everything, but subsequently turned out not to be accurate.
Why should we, during times of crises like these, tolerate false or misleading information that could indeed provoke panic, that could indeed spread misinformation and could indeed potentially cost us lives? Jakob, if you want to start, why should we tolerate this?
Yeah. First of all, I think having access to information is crucial during such times as now. I think the lack of information might lead to more panics. Actually, I mean, imagine if the government simply shut down the internet as they do in some Indian states, not necessarily related to coronavirus, but that might cause even more panic. You want to know what's going on, and you also think I think you want to understand the rationale behind the government's response. Why you're also much more likely to accept and respect social distancing measures if you actually get an explanation for why this is necessary. And I think also on balance that and this there might be changes from state to state depending on trust in media, institutions, politicians, and so on. But on balance, I think you have a better chance of eliminating rumors and disinformation if you allow to keep most channels open. Also, very interestingly, very recently, The Economist published a study that showed that, in general, democracies have a lower degree of mortality than non-democracies when it comes to epidemics. Now, this data obviously didn't include the current coronavirus crisis, but still interesting. I think this data goes back to the 60s, and the authors of the study suggest that the ability to get information, to share information, inform your citizens is crucial. Is that actually an advantage for democracies? Whereas authoritarian states can move swiftly, impose measures overnight, but they may actually lack a critical feedback information of a mechanism of information. And then having done a podcast on the history of free speech, I think almost without exception, every state authoritarian government that I have looked at have adopted laws against disinformation, false information, as a measure to crack down on dissent, and it has almost always been vehemently abused, and you know that even in the United States, where you've had the Sedition Act from 1788, that I think is a big should be a danger sign for any impulses in the U.S. of what happens when you try to adopt such laws.
Well, it's funny you should bring that up. I think it was over the weekend or maybe sometime last week. I was listening to a lecture by John Barry, who wrote a book a number of years ago called The Great Influenza, which was about the Spanish flu, which killed millions of people and happened to come during World War I. And during this lecture, I think it's from 2018, he gave this lecture. He's talking about how the response to the influenza was muted or delayed here in the United States because at the time, of course, we were at war, and we also had a new sedition act that was used to punish people who essentially criticized the war effort or diminished morale within the country. And one way that it was perceived to diminish morale was to start, quote, a panic about the influenza and what it was doing to cities and states across the country. And so even in that case, even in the United States, about 100 years ago, we saw the Sedition Act being used to silence people, not just because of the influenza, but also because what it would do to the war effort. And I've heard it be discussed that the reason it's called the Spanish influenza is not because the influenza started in Spain. Actually, by all indications, it probably didn't, but rather because Spain was one of the only countries, it was a neutral country during World War I, and as a result, it didn't have these restrictions on reporting, so more people were hearing about the influenza at Spain at the time. So as a result, it got the name, the Spanish influenza. There's also, I guess, the King of Spain had contracted the virus, so that also made it top of mind for people. But it's funny how censorship 100 years ago resulted in giving a virus a name that it probably shouldn't get. I actually
that might be the best argument yet for censorship. If you at least if you're Spanish.
Some leaders might say so. I think the virus actually started, or some people believe it started in Kansas.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
Off a military base, American military base, and it was American GIs who brought it overseas when they were transported for the war efforts. Jakob, having done your History of Free Speech podcast, is this unusual, the way that some of these more authoritarian governments are responding to these crises? I mean, this seems to me to be something that all governments have done throughout time when there's a crisis that could make them look bad.
Sure. I'm pretty strong on civil liberties. I certainly understand why during this corona crisis we need, basically to say in order to safeguard health, we have to sacrifice certain liberties. So I'm okay and I'm fine. I completely understand, respect the need to sacrifice freedom of assembly, for instance, freedom of movement, even limited expanded access to private data and so on. But I think freedom of expression is a red line that you should be very careful about crossing. Also, just because you want there to be information and scrutiny about the restrictions that you adopt in terms of other rights. But you're absolutely right that especially authoritarian states have to project strength. They have to project an image of being in complete control and authority, and so they cannot tolerate a situation where their authority sort of is seen to get out of hand, where they're not on top of the situation, where suddenly people are saying, well, people are dying because you're not doing enough. That is actually poison to an authoritarian government, and that's why I think authoritarian states are at least as afraid of scrutiny, transparency, and critical opinion as they are of the virus, because if they're seen as being having lost control, not being on top of things, then their whole image on which the authority builds starts to unravel.
You were saying that as a civil libertarian, you're sympathetic and in support of some of the restrictions, whether it's on freedom of assembly or freedom of movement. But is there a way that governments, if they need to institute those restrictions, can do so in a manner that, for example, like Orban has taken authority for himself with no end date?
Yeah.
So I'm assuming when writing these laws, we as civil libertarians want a sunset provision in there.
Sure. So the Danish government has sunset clause in there. I think it's a year. I'd like to have seen expiry after 6 months, and then it could be renewed if still needed. And I think any measures should also be narrowly tailored to the actual nature of the threat. So if you need to use extraordinary measures to fight coronavirus, then those extraordinary measures should be, as far as possible, limited to this specific public health emergency, and not give you powers to do all kinds of other things that have nothing to do with coronavirus. So basically, it shouldn't just be a rubber stamp to institute all kinds of other policies that would normally require consent of parliament, or have there'd be different checks and balances that no longer apply. Those checks and balances can maybe be suspended, but only when these measures are aimed specifically at this. And obviously, they shouldn't go further than absolutely necessary. And so, I can certainly understand why, if you say, if 100 people want to meet, then you can almost, if you allow that, if people to meet, you can almost have like a mathematical model which will show how many people will die if you allow that. But if you say, we're going to crack down on disinformation, I would say you don't have the same clear and present danger to public health.
Or the same empirical justification.
Exactly. And you would also risk curtailing the benefits of criticism. For instance, I'm quite certain that health authorities have been forced to change course on issues such as face masks and other things, because there's a rigorous debate in the media, on social media, where people start questioning these. And of course, some of it is tinfoil hat conspiracy theories, but there are actually a lot of really thoughtful people out there who can provide critical thinking and different perspectives, so a lot of the times we may actually see people who can point to shortcomings in governmental policies, and that's understandable, because they are operating in real time under huge pressure with imperfect knowledge and a lack of sufficient data. So anyone would probably make mistakes, but then the more input you have, I would say, the better, even if you have to sift out a lot of nonsense as well.
Sarah, you and I work in the higher education context. What have we seen in higher ed as far as restrictions go, or lack thereof?
Well, FIRE did write to NYU Grossman School of Medicine late last month, after we learned that they had a policy ordering doctors who were faculty not to speak with reporters without approval from their marketing office. And it kind of tracks with, I think, a concerning trend we've seen in lots of places, where medical professionals are being told that their jobs are on the line if they speak out. And it's a good example of a non-government restriction in some cases that is still extremely damaging to speech and to our understanding of this pandemic.
Yeah, it's one of the ways that we learn about, one of the ways to really get the country, in my opinion, on board with some of these social distancing requirements is to actually hear what frontline workers are experiencing in the hospitals, to hear them talk about their lack of personal protective equipment, to hear them talk about the very sad state that their intensive care units are in, the patients that are coming in, the emergency procedures that they're having to take that they've never had to take before. It can animate the public to action that it otherwise might not be willing to take. We've also, this whole coronavirus thing has brought about a new kinds of issues in FIRE's world, and we've had to respond to, including a lot of classes now. Actually, I think most colleges and universities at this point have moved to online instruction, and we've seen this new phenomenon called Zoom bombing, whereby
I hate that I have to learn what Zoom bombing means.
Yeah, no, we started hearing about this almost as soon as classes started moving online. You have internet trolls. Some of these, Zoom is an online platform for teleconferencing, essentially, and a lot of the links that are used or circulated for these teleconferences are public links. It's zoom.com/nonsensical list of characters. And I guess somehow people were finding these public links and coming in and showing, infiltrating, essentially showing pornographic material, shouting racist language, putting things up on screen, all sorts of disruption to the classes. And that kind of forced us at FIRE to confront new sorts of challenges and to put out guidelines for online, considering civil liberties in online instruction, which more or less can track the principles that we use for in-person instruction, which is to say that professors, instructors should have the ability to control their classroom to the extent that people are allowed to be in the classroom, and the instructor is allowed to police expression in there. It's got to be viewpoint neutral. Anyway, I'll link in the show notes some of the principles, or the blog that we have that enumerates the principles for online instruction. But more or less, you can't allow for a heckler to come and shut down your class, just in the same way you can't have some heckler run into a classroom in a physical environment and shut down a class either. But yeah, that NYU case, of course, there's very little comparison to what happened in China and what happened in the United States. But insofar as there's been a shutdown on reporting as to what doctors are experiencing in their hospitals, that you don't even want to get close to emulating what happened in China. And Nicholas Christakis, who is a professor at Yale and of course famous for the Halloween controversy, but is himself an expert on social networks, said that was what happened at NYU, and it's what's happening with the shutdown of or the censorship or the gagging of medical professionals just makes the pandemic worse. Censorship does not help in this case. Jakob, by kind of way of wrapping up here, can we talk a little bit about the way forward in Europe? What you said, Denmark's going to open up soon. How do you think this will impact civil liberties, not just in Denmark, but in the European Union more broadly moving forward?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I would say, generally, I get the impression that if you look at polls, almost all leaders, regardless of how well they've handled the crisis or not, tend to be extremely popular.
Really interesting.
I don't know if that's across the board, but in a lot of countries, because in a time of crisis, we sort of rally together. So I think there are a couple of different scenarios. So one scenario is something that taps in to illiberal developments that have already started here in Europe, where people long more for decisive executive action and less sort of the checks and balances and independent courts and human rights and all these things that stand in the way of acting decisively on huge challenges facing society. Because and that's very much what has happened in democracies. Governments are implementing draconian decisions and measures that would normally never get. I mean, sort of the different aid packages that have been rushed through Congress in the U.S. I mean, outside a coronavirus crisis, that would never happen, right? I mean, I'm not an expert on U.S. politics, but it seems unlikely that Congress would be able to get together and agree on something like that outside an emergency. So that's sort of the more pessimistic, where we say actually we don't need all these checks and balances, rule of law guarantees. The other is saying, now we've really seen what a true emergency is. So we have to be wary about, accepting the next time politicians come running and say, oh, here's an emergency. We need new measures to limit this or that freedom because this is absolutely necessary for national security or whatever. And people might say, you know what, we gave you the benefit of the doubt during the coronavirus because that was absolutely necessary. But now we've seen what a true crisis is, and we're going to be more jealous of our freedoms going forward. I very much hope it'll be the latter scenario, but I don't know. It might also be a third one that I haven't in my limited wisdom, been able to foresee.
Well, we saw before this crisis a declining trust in the European Union. We saw, of course, Brexit. You were seeing declining trust in France as well. Has there been any indication to how that trend will play out after this as well? Like, how's the European Union factoring into this all? Because within the European Union, lots of countries are implementing their own restrictions and kind of having to fend for themselves. And I've read reporting that the European Union isn't really helping financially or otherwise in a way that a lot of countries hoped they would.
I think again, you know, there are so many hot takes on what the coronavirus will will result in. You know, will be and you know, most people, you know, their projections seem to be very much in line with their previous thinking about things. So, but I would say that this has very much been. Obviously, there's been cooperation among member states. So there's been great acts of solidarity between some member states. You know, Germany, other countries helping Italy. But very much this has been a case, I would say, of national governments reasserting their role, and the European Union has been a bit on the sidelines, not being able to coordinate effectively. I also think, you know, I don't think that's necessarily a huge problem, or it shouldn't be a huge problem for the EU, because I don't, you know, when it comes to such matters, I don't think anyone in any European country would, you know, if you had a European Union task force that were to decide on the distribution of ventilators, you know, that would simply not be acceptable to people saying, you know, oh, we have these people in Brussels who says that, you know, we need to take ventilators from Germany and give them to Italy. That would be a mess. So I think it has shown that national governments have a lot of legitimacy when it comes to these kinds of issues. And my overall impression is currently that the European Union has been a bit sidelined on this. But what it will mean in terms of civil liberties, again, I mentioned these two different scenarios. One being, you know, this has shown us that we don't really need a stringent protection of civil liberties and rule of law. We need decisive executive government that can do what is necessary. The other being, you know, we need to sacrifice liberties in times of genuine emergencies, and we need to be more jealous outside those real and genuine emergencies.
Sarah, on your end, what are you looking for or anticipating on the other side of this crisis as far as freedom of expression goes, you know, as it relates to the United States or to some of these countries that you've been tracking for many years now?
I think it'll be interesting to watch what happens with these countries passing fake news bans and enforcing them after the immediacy of coronavirus has passed. There are some countries that are known for their enforcement of fake news bans before coronavirus, like Egypt is one of the most notable examples. But, you know, we haven't seen the extent of fake news bans that we have now. So I'll be really interested in seeing whether they survive, whether people still support some kind of fake news bans after this passes, or if countries will just go back to their more traditional ways of targeting critics, like banning insults to the president or libel of the government.
Sarah, these fake news bans, that phrase "fake news," of course, came into the popular lexicon with President Donald Trump and his campaign and his use of it. Were these laws that you started to see percolate kind of a reflection of that development with President Donald Trump, or had you seen them before then? And are they calling them fake news bans, for example?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of them are just some variation on restrictions that authoritarian countries have always enforced. Um, so, you know, as in Turkey, it would be insults. Now it's fake news. Um, yeah, I do think the prevalence of the term fake news definitely exploded in the past 5 years or so. Um, but I can't say that it necessarily originated with Trump, but
people started calling them.
I think, but I think it has legitimized the crackdown on such with the use of such laws by authoritarian populist strongmen in other countries. Obviously, the concept of laws against disinformation, false information goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. But I would say that the use of fake news to target the media, label them enemies of the people, the First Amendment reigns in Trump. He, even though his campaign sort of goes after journalists, the First Amendment is a formidable barrier against that. But in other countries like the Philippines, countries like that, they don't have the same kinds of protections. But I would also say that we talked about the European Union before, and maybe one of the reasons why there has been muted criticism of Hungary is that if you go back to October 2019, the European Commission actually warned Facebook and other social media platforms that they didn't do enough to remove disinformation online, and threatened that if they don't clean up their act, they might go the regulatory way. And France in 2018, I think, or 2019, I forget, enacted a law against fake news prior to and during election campaigns. So this means that a number of liberal states and the European Union, made up of mostly liberal democracies, have in fact themselves legitimized some of these laws. Obviously, they envisage them as fighting against populism, illiberal populism, and working within rule of law guarantees with independent courts and institutions and so on. But nonetheless, I think this should prompt a rethink on the part of liberal democracies about how far you are willing to sacrifice free speech in order to fight the enemies and opponents of democracies. Because in my experience, what happens is that you actually end up legitimizing and even sort of drafting the laws and principles for the enemies of democracies by going down that road.
Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there. Jakob, before we turn away here, can you just give us an update on your podcast? You've pretty much wrapped up at this point, correct?
Yeah, so we finished with 40 episodes. So we're done with the I would say the ordinary arc of the show, and we ended up with developments after World War II at the UN at the level of international human rights. But I'll do these bonus episodes. So one coming up, like I said, with Monica Bickert, probably being released this week. Monica Bickert, who's head of policy at Facebook, coming out this week or the next. I'm also trying to line up a conversation with Dunja Mijatovic, who is the Council of Europe's High Commissioner for Human Rights. So I'll try to do these bonus episodes whenever appropriate. And then, as Sarah knows, I'm also trying to convert the podcast into a book, which I find is very, very difficult to having to sacrifice so much material. So I'm working on that as well.
Well, Jakob, for our listeners who aren't familiar with your podcast, it's called Clear and Present Danger, A History of Free Speech. Again, you're the executive director of Justitia and the co-author with Sarah of Coronavirus Has Started a Censorship Pandemic. Jakob, thanks for coming on the show. And Sarah, thank you again for joining us. And I look forward to hopefully seeing you in our office sometime soon. But who knows if we'll actually get that. Yeah, who knows if we'll actually get there.
Thanks a lot, Nico. It's a pleasure. Talk to you soon. Bye.
You two stay safe out there. This podcast is hosted, produced, and recorded by me, Nico Perrino, and edited by Aaron Reese. You can learn more about So to Speak by following us on Twitter at twitter.com/freespeechtalk or liking us on Facebook at facebook.com/So to Speak podcast. We take email feedback as well at sotospeak@thefire.org. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving us a review at Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Those reviews do help us attract new listeners to the show. And until next time, thank you again for listening.